Okay, I promised an on-time start, and that's what we're going to have because we are discussing a lot about mastery-based learning and grading in a modern classroom because there's a lot to go over, and we're still not going to hit everything that I think we would have liked, but we'll do our best to do this comprehensively and respect everyone's time. So, of course, if you're new to the Modern Classrooms project, we'll do a brief introduction of ourselves. And then we're going to dive right in. We're heavy on the research tonight. We're looking at research-based justifications and research-based best practices for a mastery-based approach in our K-12 classrooms. Then we'll take a closer look at what mastery-based grading looks like in modern classrooms. We get many questions about that, and we're going to peek inside a few classrooms tonight. We'll end with one of my favorite topics, and that's just manageable mastery-based grading. How do we keep this, and we'll having grace on ourselves and making sure that this is sustainable for an entire school year and an entire teaching career. And finally, your questions and going further with the Modern Classrooms project. So if you are new to us, we are a nonprofit organization. We seek to meet students' needs through blended, self-paced, and the star of the hour, mastery-based learning. And we lead a movement of educators throughout the world in implementing this research-backed instructional approach. If I haven't gotten to meet you yet, my name is Kate Gaskell, proud former social studies teacher in Washington, D.C. public schools, now head of teaching and learning here at the Modern Classrooms Project. And I'm joined by one of my favorite teachers tonight, Moira.
Hi everybody. Yes, I am joining from Alexandria, Virginia. I teach in Fairfax County Public Schools, and I was introduced to Modern Classrooms in, I think, the summer of 2019, and I've been hooked on it ever since. So I'm really excited to talk to you all today. I'm a geosystems teacher, high school teacher. Right now I'm teaching 11th and 12th graders.
Thanks, Moira. So the Modern Classrooms Project, was born out of after us as teachers experienced kind of the flawed premise that education around the world is based on, and that is that one size is supposed to somehow fit all. So we know as educators, when we look out in our classrooms, that's simply not the case. We can look at our students who are there every day. They are on grade level, they are even above grade level, some of them, and oftentimes we struggle to provide them rigorous work and challenge them. The work is too easy, and we're not giving them the complete education that we could. We have our students who are absent. They're not in school for legitimate reasons. I said in the Edutopia video, oftentimes really heartbreaking reasons, and that's very real. We know that those absences can start a vicious cycle of falling behind, becoming further disengaged, missing more school, and the consequences can be quite severe. And then we have our students who are below grade level. They are below grade level in math, below grade level in reading. They have so many skills, but they struggle sometimes with some of our classwork. And we, as that one teacher again up front, are struggling to somehow meet the needs of this diverse group of learners, trying to teach everyone everything on the same day. This can lead us, of course, to feeling like we're a failure. It's our fault, and we see people leaving our profession and really feeling demoralized. At the Modern Classrooms Project, we really thought there had to be a better way. So now, as a nonprofit organization, we offer training programs to empower educators. We take our research-backed instructional model, and through a variety of different professional developments, we believe in the tenets of blended instruction. In other words, I like to say I've cloned myself on video, and our students can access teacher-created instructional videos when that content is appropriate for them. Of course, we need a self-paced structure to do that. Now, since we are free, we've cloned ourselves on video, if you will, we can facilitate a self-paced classroom where learners are getting what they need when they need it. They're studying within a unit at their own pace. And then this self-pacing and blended learning allows us to grade based on mastery. We're not grading on completion, compliance, and just, being rigid to our calendars anymore. Students progress to the next lesson when they demonstrate mastery.
This is one of the parts that I really like. It's reshaping the teacher experience. So when when I was coming to when modern classrooms really came into my life, I was at a point in my teaching where I think I had been teaching for like 12 or 13 years. And I was, teetering a little bit on teacher burnout. And I was also playing around with a flexible classroom in a virtual sense, but also like with the furniture in the classroom and all of that. So modern classrooms came in at a really interesting time. And when I implemented, one thing that I definitely noticed is that it did reshape the teacher experience because I wasn't exhausted at the end of the day anymore, because everything was just restructured in how I was running things. So things were just calmer. They weren't flat. It wasn't boring, but I wasn't spending a lot of energy on things. I was spending my energy in small groups, one-on-one with students, in things that really were high leverage in helping the students. I think that it also, for my students, really reshaped their experience. I was never a teacher that was like getting into like, I'm not like a strict authoritarian teacher and I wasn't getting into power struggles, but I definitely was having my blood pressure raised when I'm trying to start class and then students are coming in late and then, I have to repeat what I'm saying and why were you late? But I mean, really none of that actually matters. And so for the students, I think the experience is different also because they're coming in and they are figuring out like what it is that I have to do. They're looking at the board, they're looking at their project tracker or their lesson tracker. They're picking up their materials if they're in person. And they are in charge of their learning, and I'm sort of like helping that and I'm facilitating them with it, and I'm really focused on our relationship, the student to teacher relationship. So I noticed that for me it was a lot less exhausting, and for the students I just had like zero like discipline issues. There just weren't any discipline issues because the students were choosing how to use their time, but then also like we weren't having all those sort of like problems with like them coming in late or anything like that. They came in and they got started pretty much, I would say like 80 to 85% of them got started within 5 minutes on their own. The other ones I'd sometimes have to talk to.
We'd love to hear a little bit about you. We do work with teachers in these variety of ways. If you could indicate how you've worked with the Modern Classrooms project so far, we'd just love to know who we have on the call. If you're not familiar with our work, we have a free online course. It's a great place to learn the essentials. The virtual mentorship program pairs you with an expert teacher mentor like Moira and many of our other amazing mentors. Schools and districts enter into partnerships with us through the virtual mentorship program. And we are gearing up for our busiest summer yet. We'll talk about Virtual Summer Institute at the very end of the call. I'll practice my teacher wait time, give everybody about 10 more seconds to tell us how they know Modern Classrooms so far. All right, I'm gonna, for the sake of time, looks like most of us on the call, we have taken the free course and we have followed MCP on social media. We'll be actually talking, if you're a Facebook user, we'll be talking about the Facebook group a couple times tonight. So Moira and I are gathered with you tonight to talk about mastery-based grading. And let's start out, Moira, what do we mean when we say mastery-based learning and grading? What are we talking about?
So we're sort of thinking about this when we're planning out the unit and planning out the lessons, and we're trying to think about like, what is it that a student would be able to do or be able to explain if they were, on standard with this. You're really thinking those ideas out and you're sort of building some rubrics around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, it's kind of like that graphic at the beginning where we talk about how rather than holding everyone to the same lesson on the same day, We're giving kids an opportunity to spend time on a skill until they, again, like the slide says, achieve proficiency. And I mentioned that we were going to be heavy on the research tonight. And so let's go ahead and get started about, if you're not already bought into a mastery-based grading system, there's a lot that we can do, I think, to convince you of its benefits for students. First, of course, is that it enhances student learning outcomes. Mastery-based approaches have been shown to help with long-term retention of content. Students feel better in school. They display higher rates, or they indicate higher rates of satisfaction, and they have more positive attitude about the content that they're learning if they're in a mastery-based classroom. Multiple studies have pointed to this. And then finally, mastery-based environments can shift how students think about themselves. I love this point. There have been multiple studies again that show that it improves their academic self-concept, and their growth mindset as well. I think those are really important as we start talking to students about, as they look to their futures, the purpose of education. This point here at the end really sticks with me and was honestly why I made the shift to a modern classroom. So here at the Modern Classrooms Project, we're very fortunate to partner with the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. They go through our survey data every year when we talk to students, talk to teachers, but they also conduct extensive studies and a synthesis of research on the main tenets of our model. And when we asked them to take a look at mastery-based learning and grading, they came back to us with 4 best practices that research validates that really in a mastery-based learning environment, we can do these things to aid in our students' success. So if we divide learning into small chunks, provide adequate opportunities for practice, assess frequently, and provide constructive feedback, and adjust instruction as needed. Now, we've gathered here tonight to talk about what does this look like? How do these practices come to life in a modern classroom? So let's start with this first one. When we talk about dividing learning into smaller chunks, I think that it's a general best practice, but it's really necessary when we are creating a mastery-based learning environment. We really need to plan backwards, and we're going to be talking about this. We're going to be talking about this at a few points tonight. So we hold up UBD, or understanding by design, as kind of our gold standard in planning, and it really makes our lives easier for us as teachers as we're planning out mastery-based units. But it makes everything clearer for the students too. It also helps us determine what mastery is, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. In our modern classrooms, we take this concept of dividing learning into small chunks, and that's where our mastery checks come in. If you're new to the Modern Classrooms Project, or if you've only seen the Edutopia video, we referred to them as exit tickets in that Edutopia video. Mastery checks is just kind of truer to our sentiment. But every lesson ends with a bite-sized assessment. And it's from that assessment, that we determine if a student can go on to the next lesson, or if we feel they're not quite at mastery yet and they need to take some more time. And they can progress, again, only when they've demonstrated mastery in our classrooms. And then finally, how we'll assess and we'll get better results on our mastery checks if our instruction before that mastery check, was clear, objective driven. And again, we're reducing the cognitive load. We're dividing learning into small chunks to make this more manageable for our students. Here's an example of a mastery check. If you're new to us, this is from I believe this is a biology classroom, 10th grade. And we see here, the teacher has clearly labeled the objective. We'll be talking about the importance of, making sure our students are aware of what they're being assessed on. We see a couple questions. Our teacher has identified this is kind of like, this is the litmus test. This is how I know at the end of this lesson if my students got it. And then very clear rubric at the end here. Is this mastered? What do I need to do? And we can move on. This is an example from a 6th grade ELA classroom. Just again, a bite-sized assessment that's going to come at the end of a lesson. Mastery checks do not always have to be pencil and paper. They can be done on computers. They can be done on whiteboards. They can be done verbally between the student and teacher. These are just a few examples of some of the most common forms they take in a modern classroom. Moira, talk to us about practice a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So there's practice can come in all sorts of different forms. Definitely when you create your ed puzzle, that's part of the practice. They're watching the video and they're doing those practice questions that you're embedding. But other forms of practice might include, we have an online textbook. So sometimes our students will read the online textbook and they'll answer some of the questions in there. It's mostly for practice and sometimes for extra practice. Another thing that we do is we create assignments. So normally I'll have the ed puzzle and then the assignment. When I was in person, I was creating paper copy assignments that the students were completing in class. And they were, usually like a page or two. They were designed to take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. And now that we've been virtual up until next week, actually is our first week back. And we've been using the gizmos, the Explore Learning website. And so we've been using those gizmos as our assignment. And sometimes we'll do part of the gizmo with the students, and then we'll have some questions that they do on their own, and they'll turn those in. Another good practice assignment that I use sometimes are discussion board questions in a virtual world. I guess I'm like enmeshed in the virtual world right now, but we use the discussion board questions in Google Classroom. And so we'll ask the students to respond. Sometimes we ask them respond to short videos, and I'm a science teacher, so sometimes we'll show them demonstrations or something like that in a video, and they respond, and then we ask them to respond to each other. But generally speaking, they're trying to build their skills. These are low stakes. They are trying to develop mastery. Oftentimes they're working together. That works really well. When I was in person, a lot of the students would even watch their ed puzzle videos together, and they'd like share headphones and they'd be taking their notes together, which was nice. And then the mastery checks are these short, like Kate was talking about, almost like an exit ticket. You do want to sort of have the students doing these individually and sort of maybe at a separate table if you're in person, somehow ensuring the validity of the mastery checks, because it can be really powerful data for you in what direction certain students might need to go, or what direction you might need to go as a teacher for the whole class. Like sometimes you might need to loop back on something if students aren't doing well. But generally, you want these to be short, you want them to be valid, and you want them to not take you too long to grade them.
Mhm. We have a quick question in the chat, or Q&A rather. What are gizmos, Moira?
Oh, so gizmos are online laboratory simulations. So like we do rocks and minerals. And so in person, we would normally be looking at minerals, and they might be like, doing different tests on them. But in the gizmo, they're doing it like virtually on this little computer thing. It's cute. It's good.
Oops.
So it's one thing to think about what your assignments are going to be and what your mastery checks are going to be, but then you also sort of have to think about how are these going to go into the grade book. So different teachers do different things, and you want to think this out, and you have to think about your own situation. Some teachers grade assignments, some teachers don't grade them at all. Some teachers grade ed puzzles, and some people don't grade those at all. And then sometimes, most everybody is putting mastery checks into the grade book, but some people are putting them in as classwork or as like assignment grades, whereas other teachers are putting them in as like summative grades. So that's something that you have to think about and work through. And then okay, so I was like, is this still me? Definitely you want students to feel like a lot of the work that they're doing is practice work, and you want them to understand that like doing this work is going to help build their skills to do well on the mastery check. You really want them to be able to see the connection between it, and you want it to be well aligned. But like I was saying, the assignment or the practice work, you can be really creative with it. You don't have to do all of the things I was talking about, but you also don't have to always do the same thing every single time. And sometimes you might want to do like a Socratic seminar if you're in person, and that could be part of the assignment for the students. Or you might want to have a lab that the students are doing if you're a science teacher. So you just want to keep all of that in mind. You don't want things to get maybe too dull and too systematic. You also want your personal flair to be in your class, but you do want the students to understand that they can revise their work. And it's interesting because I was talking to a teacher who just went through modern classrooms training this winter. And I was talking to her today about a conversation she had with a student, and he was like, oh, well, it's just that this class, with her doing it as modern classrooms, is so different because with all my other classes, I take a quiz and then that's it. And I never come back to it ever again. So I didn't realize that I should like come to office hours and like retake things and, talk to you. So it does take the students a little bit of time to get used to the system and getting used to taking risks and trying again.
Yeah. As a social studies teacher, I think some of my favorite practice activities were like those good old chalk talks,
Mhm.
gallery walks, some of those. So when Johns Hopkins came back to us and said, well, if you're going to have a mastery-based learning environment, another best practice is to assess frequently and provide constructive feedback. And at the Modern Classrooms Project, we thought, well, this is great for us because we're already including mastery checks at the end of every lesson. And again, because we use those mastery checks, like Moira said, we oftentimes we ensure students are doing them independently and without the aid of resources because we're putting a lot of stock in those mastery checks. This determines if a student is ready to go on to more content, perhaps a more complex part of a skill or material of a unit. And we need to know that they got step A before they're going to go on to step B. Our mastery checks are criterion reference, so meaning they are tied to a single objective. We're not norming them to how they're doing against their peers, and we communicate those goals to students in advance. I would open every instructional video with, and this is what you should be able to do by the end of this lesson. These are the questions you should be able to answer. We saw on that example of the 10th grade biology class, we saw the objective clearly on the mastery check. That objective had been with the students throughout the entire lesson. Of course, we give specific timely feedback on student mastery checks. It's great when we can grade mastery checks in the moment, especially when we are doing in-person learning. Those are great, when you can, before the kid leaves the mastery check table, say, we need to go over something, or I need you to check your notes, or I want you to talk to so-and-so, or, once you go look at this poster or rewatch that part of the instructional video again. It's great when you can catch those in the moment. However, even if it has to go to the next day, and the opportunity that we have in our modern classrooms to revisit student misunderstanding, this was a complete game changer for me, because so often, unless I was going to pull a kid out of, my neighbor's chemistry class, what was done was done. And I would see them in the next class, and they'd get their work back, but we didn't have time to go over it. And I couldn't take those 5 minutes to sit with that student and give them that feedback. When in a modern classroom, we're really responding to the feedback. We're not only giving it, but we're using that data to inform our instructional plan for the student that day by indicating, what they need to do. Do they need to revise? Can they go on to the next lesson? Should they sit with us? And then finally, I love this question when we get it because it's a tricky one. And we'll talk about this more in depth. But part of assessing frequently and providing that constructive feedback is we have to know in our own minds what we're holding the student work to. We have to know, well, what is mastery? And we should always be thinking about this as we plan, as we assess, and as we reteach. What's the target we want our student to be hitting? Again, when Johns Hopkins came back to us with this best practice for a mastery-based learning environment, we thought, well, we can do this. We're already doing this, in fact. And that's, of course, being flexible, adjusting instruction as needed. In our modern classrooms, we encourage students to reference their resources, and we often encourage them to do this before revising or before reassessing. In my classroom, before a student could, maybe retake a mastery check, or I didn't want this to turn into a guessing game, especially in my social studies classroom. So what I would do is I might not even point out the direct student error on the mastery check. I might say, I need you to review your notes, or I need you to review key issue 3. And then I want you to come back up here and read your mastery check. And so many times kids found their own errors that way. All right. So when we, whether that's talking to a peer, again, referencing an aid in the classroom, rewatching a video, we're creating more self-reliant learners when we encourage them to reference their resources. And this is a form of adjusting our instruction. My very favorite part about my modern classroom, of course, being able to work with small groups and kids one-on-one, where we can really clarify these misunderstandings soon after they happened. I didn't get this opportunity when I taught traditionally. It was me and it was 25 students. My modern classroom changed this for me, again, by kind of putting me in the center of the room, I would say, and my interactions with kids were far more meaningful, both at a social emotional level, but also at an academic level as well. And that, again, was a form of adjusting my instruction, was being able to reteach or review when necessary based on student mastery check data. As we build our modern classrooms, we need to have grace with ourselves. Your modern classroom, the first year, people aren't kidding when they say our PD is a lot of work. There's planning backwards, and then there's also planning and preparing backwards. And that's what we do that's what we do to have a modern classroom unit ready for students. But it is so worth it, because then we are free to really do that really good one-on-one small group work with our kids. Now, as you're teaching that prep for the second time, or as it's your second year doing modern classrooms, this is where we can start to build things out. So I was able to do things my second, third year in modern classrooms that I wasn't able to do my first. I kind of assembled a library, if you will, of instructional aids that I wanted to have on hand. I understood the misconceptions or misunderstandings that kids had made the previous year. So I started making sortables, or I would have a certain map handy, or a photo ready to go. And I would have this bank of reteaching resources ready my second and third year, after kind of getting the bones of my modern classroom course built. Then I could kind of start to put some of the meat on the bones, so to speak. But again, I think this is another area where you have to give yourself grace. You can't do it all the first year. And as you're building out, it's going to become more rich and complex for students. Our students, of course, adjusting instruction as needed is being flexible and understanding they can demonstrate mastery in various forms. It doesn't always need to be a pencil to paper mastery check. We can be flexible to their needs. I had a colleague in my school who regularly would ask kids a few questions before the mastery check. And if a kid just nailed it, she thought, you're good, go on to the next lesson. There's, I can tell by the level of detail in your answer that you don't need to sit down and take this. You've shown mastery to me, go on. All right. So again, we can be really flexible. I've mentioned it before, but one thing I really, really liked to do in my modern classroom is when I had perhaps a learner who struggled, sometimes even something as simple as a whiteboard and a marker. They would do better sometimes. I think there was a fear of the permanence of the pencil to the paper, and they would sometimes do better on a mastery check if I just simply allowed them to do it with this adhesive whiteboard that I just kept on the table with, and just being able to assess that way. And then again, meaningfully differentiating. If you haven't taken our free course here at Modern Classrooms, we talk about must do, should do, and aspire to do structure. We're putting a link in the chat to help you out with that if you're new to it. But this is how we ensure that students are meaningfully engaged, regardless of where they're assessing in our class. So our students who are moving through content faster, they still have meaningful work to do through our aspire to do tasks, whereas we can hold a firm line of mastery on must do tasks for a majority of our learners. So I love this. We get this question a lot, and it's hard. It's a hard question. What is mastery? And it's going to look different in different subjects and different grade levels. But Moira, what do you have to tell us about what is mastery?
Yeah, and I even tying this into what somebody was just saying in the chat about how it is a lot of work, a lot of prep work, but it really pays off. And somebody mentioned that when you have course alike collaborators, it even speeds up the work even more. And I think that one thing that I've talked with some of the modern classroom teachers at my school about the difference that we've seen is working through your units and really thinking this through, like what is mastery, and thinking it through as a content team is such a good exercise. But generally speaking, it depends on what school you're at, how you go about this, whether or not you have an end of course standardized test that the students need to take, or whether or not you're an elective. But generally speaking, we're looking at the state standards. If your district gives you like a framework, sometimes that can be a really helpful place for you to start. Then you might also be looking at the students' IEP goals. We're looking for things like the standard continuing beyond one grade level. So it's like something that is a really basic and cross-cutting concept maybe. And then whether or not the standard has crossover value to other subjects, potentially with some leverage. And then the readiness, whether or not there are certain skills that the students might need for more advanced skills. And then, like I was mentioning, the class that I'm teaching is in Virginia called an SOL class. So there are certain standards that we know that they're going to be held accountable for at the end of the year. And so we want to make sure that they have a very strong foundation in those standards so that they're successful, because they need that for their high school diploma. And yeah, I think this is such an interesting thing and such an interesting study when we're thinking about what you as a teacher or what we as a content team consider mastery, and then where you're putting the bar for what is proficiency. And this idea that if you're not quite sure, you want to err on the side of being higher. And so if you're not sure where to go, looking at, hopefully, if you're not a first year teacher, if you have a little bit of data, you can look at your students' performance from the previous year, and you're looking at the students that are scoring in the B and the A range and figuring out like, okay, where were they at? And then considering that to be the proficiency. So setting it there. And that's an interesting thing to me. And I think that drives a lot of the conversations or the thoughts that you're having when you're putting some of this work together and figuring out what it is that you consider mastery. And definitely using rubrics is going to be so helpful for you for two reasons. One, it is going to force you to articulate what mastery is to the students. If we can't do that, then the students are a little bit vague, and it's harder for them to hit that goal because they're vague on what the goal is. And then the other reason that it's going to be really important to you is that this will make the grading process and providing feedback much more efficient for you and much more useful. It's going to make the conversations with the students, if you're in person, or even like maybe you're having them on email or on providing feedback on a Google document, it's going to make your conversations richer for the students. Like you have specific things that they need to work on in order to show proficiency or mastery.
Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of questions at the Modern Classrooms Project about setting up a grade book, or how I should grade something, what I should grade. And it is tough for us as a global nonprofit to give really helpful answers. I think we were founded on the fact that we trust teacher judgment, we trust teacher professionalism, expertise, and we know that individual teachers, they can, using colleagues, using resources, they can exercise their professional judgment to find age and discipline appropriate systems that work for their schools and their districts. So while we can't offer, really specifics on setting up a grade book, deciding what to grade, categorizing grades, or, converting your school to some sort of school-wide system, what we can do is we can connect you with other educators who are taking similar journeys in their classes of mastery-based grading. And we're going to hear from a few tonight. So this is Cheyenne. She's a fourth grade teacher in Pennsylvania, one of our amazing mentors here at the Modern Classrooms Projects. And she talks about her mastery checks are formative, is her system, and she does give a summative end of unit assessment. And she, again, we'll send all this out tomorrow. You'll be able to review these slides in more detail. So if you find yourself really connecting with someone's philosophy, you can really get into the details. If she needs students to revise a mastery check, she works with them in a small group or one-on-one, and she asks them to explain their thinking. When they're ready, she has them work from a slightly different mastery check as a reassessment. If after this, they can't, or if they can't explain their thinking, if she still does not feel that they're ready for a mastery check, what she does is I've heard about this in her room. It sounds so cool, but she really makes use of student teachers or teachers' assistants, if you will. So students who have mastered the content, she really relies on these talking stems or sentence starters to help enable them to be better helpers for their peers. So she observes, provides feedback, and then the students are given a mastery check the next day. She talks about how for most of the time, this really has worked for her. She says that if she encountered a student, who perhaps wasn't there, she wouldn't give up on them, but she'd have them revisit on this roadmap or a game board that she does in her class. And I really connected with her philosophy and her system in her classroom. So Monty is another one of our mentors. She teaches middle school science. If you're active in the Facebook group, you know and love Monty. So in her classroom, the students do receive one classwork grade, depending on where they fall on the must do, should do, or aspire to do. And I know Monty and I have talked about this. A lot of our teachers who do must do, should do, aspire to do, and then assign grades on that, of course, it keeps in mind, and we keep in mind students who have IEPs and 504s, they still have the possibility to earn an A. This system looks a little different for our students who receive accommodations and modifications. Like Cheyenne, mastery checks are also formative assessments in Monty's classroom. So I thought this was so interesting, and I really loved how she did this. So students can reattempt any assignment. They can retake mastery checks twice. She'll intervene before that second one and try to do a reteach, try to really go over resources. And then I thought this was so interesting. So she gives all students the option to boost their grades on the final unit summative assessment. So if they demonstrate mastery of a particular standard on the final unit, on the summative of the final unit, she then goes back into the grade book and increases that lesson's, that standard's mastery check. Of course, the reasoning being they did show mastery. So his classroom is really interesting. So he's a music teacher, and he teaches music in Spanish, and the kids construct songs. So I thought this was really interesting. What he does is, they're practicing by creating a part of the song, and a mastery check is a simple screenshot. I've seen writing teachers do this too, where that essentially they're practicing by, let's say, writing a body paragraph, and then of course the mastery check is then showing the teacher their body paragraph. He does this, of course, through screenshots. And then, so this is interesting. He checks mastery checks off as mastered or needs revision. And at the end of the unit, converts the percentage of mastered lessons to a grade scale. So he uses this example. If he were pulling progress report data in a 10 lesson unit, if lesson 4 is on pace and the student has mastered 3 lessons, their progress grade is a 75%. He records this as a formative assessment. So Moira, to your point earlier, when you were talking about kind of really being data informed and looking at student mastery checks as a way to inform our teaching practice. So he keeps a close eye on his revisions. He talks about that here. So of course he puts R for revise in the pacing tracker. If something's missing or it's not quite right, he wants an opportunity to talk to that student. And I thought this was really interesting. If he has more than 5 R's or 5 revisions in his class, he takes that as an opportunity to review his instruction. So he goes back, looks at the instructional video, and makes sure that he was communicating tasks, concepts clearly. Of course, another opportunity we hear, sitting with students one-on-one, really being able to sit with them until they figure it out. Nora, another one of our mentors, she teaches middle school math. She grades assignments and mastery checks, and she puts them both in the classwork category of her grade book. Mastery checks, again, are formative in Nora's room, but they're not in assessments, they are classwork. My grade book in DC Public Schools was very similar, where I had participation, classwork, assessments. So she puts her mastery checks in classwork. She does unlimited tries to revise and reassess. And she does this for all mastery checks. Tests and quizzes can be corrected for half credit in her room. Tavia is another one of our mentors, teaches high school biology and IB biology in North Carolina. She grades mastery checks and assignments. Like Monty, she also has kind of a system where students can get deeper into a lesson through must, should, and aspire to do tasks. I really love how Tavia does like the must do, start your engines, should do, rev it up, aspire to do's are full speed ahead. That's just a reminder that you do not have to be wedded to any of the terms we use. I've seen mastery checks be called prove it's. I've seen mild, medium, spicy. I've seen just really creative things. So please make it your own. She considers mastery checks to be summative, and she has her own reasoning for that. And then I think it's interesting, again, we see the one-on-one conference or to discuss concepts they missed, being allowed to retake the mastery check. Tavia teaches high school. So we start to see students owning more and more of their learning, especially in an IB setting. So she talks about, she provides feedback. It's up to the students to revise and resubmit their classwork in particular. And she does allow test corrections. And then Moira, do you want to talk a little bit about what grading, mastery-based grading looks like in your room?
Yeah, definitely. I was just telling Kate that I feel like it's really different this year being virtual than it was last year. Last year, I was more sort of like Nora, the previous slide. I had a setup more similar to hers. But I was this year worried about, just straight grading assignments and putting it into the grade book because we were going to be online, and I wasn't sure if all of my students would always have reliable Wi-Fi. So I was trying to come up with a system that I thought would be equitable, but would also provide a lot of practice and like opportunity for all students, whether or not they had, perfect Wi-Fi or they didn't have, hardly any at all. And so I was also a little bit worried about teacher workload going into this year because I anticipated, it being higher. So I was trying to find a way to not put so many grades into my online grade book. When I did implement with Modern Classrooms in person, I was putting in, potentially 2 grades per day. So I was putting in something like 40 grades per quarter or something like this. And it did get to be like a lot of grades in the grade book. So I was trying to reduce that a little bit as well. So what I came up with this year, I'm actually liking this a lot so far. I have 7 steps that I go through with the students each week, and these categories stay every single week. And so the first step is their ed puzzle. The second step is more of a resource for them, and that's their online tech book. The third step is the assignment. So like I was saying, it's usually the Gizmo, that online lab simulation, but we mix it up and we do different assignments as well. And then their fourth step is a discussion board question. So it could just be a straight question like, have you ever seen topographic maps before? Do you use paper maps at all? Like that's always a good discussion question because usually they're like, no, I only use Google Maps or whatever their navigator is. And then the step 5 this year for me is the mastery check. And that's a 5-question multiple choice Google form because it automatically grades itself. We actually regretted our choice of wording on step 6 project because it's really more of a short like writing, a paragraph writing, and that's really an add-on to their mastery check. We wanted to make sure that the students actually understood what we were doing, and we felt like the mastery checks might lack some validity in the online world. So we wanted them to write a little bit about for instance, like the assignment that they did or the online lab that they did. And then the 7th step I love. I was doing reflections maybe at the end of every unit last year, but now I do them every week. And I ask them stuff all the way from like self-regulation to stuff about the content, like would you ever be interested in going into astronomy if that's what we're learning about, to one of the questions that's been really great to ask sort of on a regular basis is, what do you want me to know? Like what's going on with you? What do you want me to know? And that's been really good because I get a lot of good information back in those reflections. So I am giving daily feedback to the students on all of those 7 steps in Google Classroom. So whether or not I'm giving them a grade and feedback, or like the discussion board question, I don't actually grade it. I just like respond to whatever they wrote, and they're responding to like some other students in the class as well. But I am making sure that they're getting feedback every day. But when I go to determine their grade for this, we decided that the week would be a lesson. I take everything into consideration, but we more heavily weigh their mastery check and their project. And then we come up with a weekly grade and we put it into their step 7 reflection in Google Classroom with feedback. So we're saying, this is what your grade is this week. These are the things, this is where I saw you shine. These are the things that you can do to improve your grade or improve your learning on this topic. So sometimes I'll put more detailed information into their step 6 project of what they need to do to revise it. And then in the step 7 reflection, I might be like, see the notes I gave you in the project, but I really encourage you to revise that and then turn this reflection back in. And, like I try to always say it like really cheery so that they're like, oh, she wants me to revise it. And so then I just put the 1 grade into their online grade book. And I'm liking that so far. We are needing to like tweak. I know somebody somewhere was talking about rubrics and stuff. Like sometimes you do need to tweak rubrics. And also when you work on a content team, we sort of figured out like halfway through the year that we were grading things a little bit differently. So it's always that conversation of like, what does the rubric mean and how are people reading it? And you're always tweaking those with. Look, is there some, yeah, that's a great question. Cheryl just said with 150 students work to look at, is there some quick ways to assess? Kate knows this is like one of my most favorite topics.
It really is. No, it really is.
Because I don't like working all the time. Yeah, so, and how does it fit in with self-paced? That is a great question too. And when I was in person, we were doing more like three-week long units. But again, I went to the 1 week in anticipation of my students being like needing that structure. And I had taught summer school also virtually. And I just know like the students that I'm teaching, a lot of them are ghosting, like they're sort of gone. And so I just felt like the students needed that weekly grade. They needed the structure, but we still allow them, like we, circle back with them. So it's not like it's over forever after the 1 week, but we felt like this was like the easiest way to communicate things to the students and to keep an eye on them too, because when we're putting in weekly grades, then that triggers in a whole bunch of interventions if we're starting to see that students are falling off. But to the other questions of quick ways to assess, the Edpuzzle grades itself, I'm unlucky because I'm in Fairfax and we have really strong permissions in our Google, or I don't know what they're called, but in our Google Classroom. So like Edpuzzle speaks to Google Classroom, but my district won't allow them to speak. So if you're in a district where they can speak, that's a totally quick thing for you. But the Edpuzzle grades itself, the textbook grades itself, the assignment, I grade, but I really only eyeball it. And I know this is in another slide later on. There are those canary questions that you can look at. And sometimes when I do the Gizmo assignments, I do some of the questions with them. So I'm not usually regrading that because I already gave you some of that. I'm looking for like the conclusion question to see what they say, to see if they're on track. Discussion board, I'm just responding to what they're saying. The mastery check grades itself. The project is where I spend most of my time. So that's like their written work. And that's where I'm trying to actually like give them some advice. And then the reflection also is where I'm trying to make that personal connection with them and give them some feedback.
So when we
And
talk about, Moira and I love to talk about like systems to make this actually manageable,
yes.
because it can be mastery-based grading can be, I would say, it's one of the things for teachers who are new to modern classrooms where it can really overwhelm them. So we are two educators. I'll just go ahead and talk about these three areas where we feel very passionate through this entire process of how can we make mastery-based grading just more manageable for us as the teacher. And we've kind of isolated it into three categories, like our mindsets, our planning, and our systems. And trust me, we are not going to get to all of this. We did an entire podcast that I highly will put it in the chat at the end. Where we really got to nerd out and talk about manageable and sustainable mastery-based grading. But here are some of the highlights. When we think about grading, Moira, were you a grading procrastinator? I forget. Yeah.
Like a little bit, like I wasn't, like I had some friends that were going like 4 weeks. I'm like, how, like admin's going to talk to you. I usually 2 weeks was like oh my gosh, I have to get this done.
Yeah. And for me, I very much I had to examine my mindset when it came to sometimes like my grading. And I think I came to the conclusion that I really procrastinated on grading sometimes because I thought that was an indictment. That was, when a student didn't do well, that was my fault. And I didn't want to face that failure. I didn't want to face that pile of papers there waiting for me. But modern classrooms really helped me, frame grading in a very different way, because it's not grading, it's tracking my kids' growth and progress, because I have to make instructional choices the next day for every single student based on their mastery check data, based on their assignments. And then it's not grading, it's giving my kids feedback that is actually helpful. Time after time, we'll put this link in the chat, but it really, if there's a single thing that can really move a needle with student learning, a timely, concentrated feedback really can make a big difference for kids. And then of course, just that reminder to keep our time closely aligned to what directly helps our students. It directly helps our students when we can leave them comments or feedback on work. It's going to help them more than if we get that bulletin board just right, or if we do those other things that I know we're tempted to do and we're split in so many directions as educators. We've talked a little bit about our planning and what that can do to eventually make mastery-based grading more manageable for us, but it's worth going back and just reminding ourselves to plan backwards. Honestly, start with the mastery check. Starting with the mastery check, knowing what we want our students to master in that particular lesson, just like we plan a unit backwards, we should plan a lesson backwards. And that way we're ensuring that our instruction is going to align. Our practice is going to prepare students for this assessment, and our video is going to equip kids to practice this new skill. Establishing criteria for mastery ahead of time. Moira, I love how you even go so far and you create your columns in the grade book at the beginning of the unit. I think we're far more likely to just enter our grades and get that form of feedback to students when that's there waiting for us. And Moira referenced this a little bit, but this idea about canary questions on the practice piece or assignments. A lot of times educators get very bogged down and they say like, how on earth am I supposed to go through this entire assignment before I determine if a student is ready for a mastery check? Or how am I supposed to just keep up with all this grading, period? And this idea about the canary questions, you are the teacher, you know your content, you're the expert here. So think to yourself on this practice piece, what are your canary questions where you can tell that a student is ready for a mastery check? What are those 2, 3, depending on the length of this practice? What are those questions that you can really link to? Another tip here, of course, is just asking students, asking them a few questions before the mastery check. That's going to help you assess, and hopefully then you'll have students who are truly ready. They're ready for the mastery check when they're going to take it. General reminder, we talk about it in the free online course and virtual mentorship program. Keep those mastery checks brief. We want this to really be a true litmus test in a few questions. How can you get that pulse check on your students? And then, Moira and I like this, can a machine grade it for me? Is this an example? It doesn't have to be every mastery check, but is this an example where you can set up when we return to physical school, even like a couple computers that have goformative.com or Google Forms up? and it's just going to do it for you. When we can automate some of this, it does make us last longer and frees ourselves to be, again, doing the really rich work one-on-one with students. So our systems, Moira and I could talk about systems all day, but we're not going to. Check out that podcast. So again, asking students questions before mastery check using self-checklists. I know teachers who even keep answer keys in the room for practice and have students compare those to their answers. When we teach students how to use their peers, check their resources, and even how to ask questions. I don't get it is not a question. I have a question is not a question. When we can in age appropriate ways get our students to articulate, I don't understand number one that talks about the beginning of the Great Depression. I have checked my notes and I'm still unclear how the stock market crash contributed. Okay, that's a perfectly appropriate for an 11th grade US history student. It's a perfectly appropriate question that they can ask you, then saving your time and theirs. Considering colored paper for mastery checks and systems like turn-in bins and clothespins. Colored paper was a godsend for me in my modern classroom. I put every mastery check on a different color, so I knew yellow was lesson 1, blue was lesson 2, orange was lesson 3. That made my sorting and grabbing so much easier. I knew what mastery checks were there, could sort them, and it just made the system of grading a lot easier, and then I used clothespins to say, these are revised, these are mastered, these are, I haven't gotten to them yet, but I'm going to grade them as soon as I can. Sorting and grading, sorting and grading, sorting and grading. Always I don't think there was a time where I didn't have in a faculty meeting or something, I didn't have mastery checks in my hands pre-sorted because I used that colored paper. It just helped me stay on top of it more. And then with remote learning, those of you who are not learning in person, just please don't forget to have grace on yourself and establish those cutoff times. If a student gets a mastery check-in at 10 o'clock, there's no reason they need to have feedback at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. We can establish some cutoff times. So again, we want teaching to be sustainable. You're not good for anyone if you're so burned out you can't be in the classroom anymore, right? So if we can find ways to keep you doing the amazing work you do, and if a cutoff time that says, there's no guarantee you'll have feedback on a mastery check that comes in past 5 p.m., that comes in past, whatever time that is for you. If you still, and I'm sure you still have questions, especially some of those specific ones that pertain to your grade book, that pertain to maybe a school-wide system or shift that you're hoping to make, our Facebook discussion group is a really good place to ask those questions. Again, as putting on my modern classroom hat as a national or global organization, rather, it's difficult for us to advise on what you should do for, developing those age-appropriate, content-appropriate systems that meet your school district's gradebook policy. However, you can get ideas in the Facebook group to see what other teachers are doing. If you haven't taken our free course, of course, we strongly recommend that. You'll have access to all the content and tutorials, but the virtual mentorship program is really where you're going to get the one-on-one coaching from mentors like Moira, like Nora, like Tavia, like those who we went into their classrooms briefly tonight. And if you are on the fence about signing up for our virtual mentorship program, I really need to talk about Summer Institute real quickly. It's all the benefits of the virtual mentorship program and more. So Summer Institute, I like to think of it as Modern Classroom goes to camp. And because it's summer, we have time for more fun things, including more live presentations. So it's not just you and your mentor, you'll be kind of a part of a cohort that receives live presentations from Modern Classroom staff 3 times. Now, if those presentations were not enough for you, we have optional presentations covering, everything from advanced Canvas, building equity in your modern classroom, modern elementary classrooms. We have office hours and a message board feature that we'll be checking every day from 9 to 5. So it's the same price as the virtual mentorship program, but again, it just offers us a bit more flexibility because of the time of the summer. So we want to be sure to leave you with some really good resources here on our last page. It does include the episode 23 of our podcast. So if you want to really dive into manageable grading, and we even get into manageable parent communication in that episode, that's a really good episode of our podcast to check out. There's a lot of good resources on this slide. 1 month from tonight, I'll be joined by educator Kristen Moore, and we're going to be going over project-based learning in a modern classroom. We're really excited for that one. But let's talk about some of your questions that I know Moira was doing a really nice job in the Q&A. I wanted to lift up Crystal's question just because I thought it was so strong. And it's a question that we get frequently. And Crystal asked, when students retake a mastery check, is it the same or the original, or is it the same as the original or a new version? And like most things with teaching, it depends. Depends on the discipline a lot of times. So I would say it's not uncommon for math teachers to create multiple mastery checks, simply because just different variables, it's a bit more possible than it was, let's say, for me in my history classroom. If I was answering, like if the students had to answer, let's say, just historical content questions like the sides of World War II, it's difficult to create a second version of a mastery check on that. So there's a few things that we have teachers do, even if they are math teachers, simply to make this a bit more manageable. I would say the first is in your mastery checks, if you want to avoid creating multiple versions, of course, you can always make multiple versions, but if you want to avoid this, try to write your mastery checks in a way that they accommodate infinite retakes, we might say. So it's perfectly fine to ask a question in a physics class about, a car drives at a velocity of 30 miles per second for 10 seconds. How far away was it when it started? How far was it when it started? That's a fine question, but you can also tell students, pick an object and assign it a velocity. It cannot be zero. Pick a time, and then ask them questions based on based on the task that they create. You can do this. Let's say, tell us about the rise of an authoritarian state and how propaganda contributed to this. Okay, so if we can keep our mastery checks a bit more open-ended, that can accommodate more of that infinite retake. Another thing to do, as I mentioned it earlier, is, we don't have to be so quick to identify exactly where the student erred on the mastery check. It's perfectly appropriate to put this back on the students. Can you double check? Where you inserted your numbers? You've made a claim, but do you have evidence for this? I think that I really like to just say a simple, like, can we go review our notes, and then you tell me what's wrong here? That can really go a long way, and we can avoid creating multiple versions of a mastery check. Again, it's always an option, though. That was a really good question, Crystal. Let's see. Julie's question. Hey, Julie, when the unit ends and you still have students who have not reached the end of the unit, do you move them on, or do you keep them on the unit until they did not complete? I would say that I'm curious for your thoughts, Moira. I would say this is where, especially at the beginning of the year, when I may not know my students as well, I may not be as familiar if they do receive accommodations. I might not be just familiar with them as learners. So I was more likely to see this at the beginning of the school year than I was as the year went on. As the year went on, I would do a better job of concentrating on must-do lessons or must-do tasks with that particular student, and maybe even finding ways to accommodate within those must-dos. So this might be that their practice is shorter. The instructional video might be the same, simply because I couldn't make an additional one. But perhaps they received notes that were more like a guided note type. And then mastery might be done verbally. At the beginning of the year, until I really get to know that learner, I think it kind of goes back to where we talked about kind of the criteria for when we're setting our mastery threshold, and we're looking at these ideas about like endurance. Is this something that they really need to know? Does this go beyond one unit? Essentially, is this a concept that they have to know in another unit? Then I might find a way to at least draw out what I felt like those enduring and essential concepts were from my previous unit. And whether that's they do one more lesson in the old unit before joining us on the new one, or I ask them to come at lunch, or there's some way that I kind of go back to those 4 ideas about what's my mastery threshold. Endurance would be the strongest one for me, and that's where I would be likely to suss out some good information from a unit that a student had not yet completed before they joined us in a new unit.
Yeah, I was answering some of that because we had some of those questions in there as well. And you hate to be like that, but the answer is really, it depends, because it depends on so many things. It depends on your school policies, your department policies, what you and your content team have agreed to do. And so sometimes you're like constrained by those policies in what you do. And then it really, for me, also depends on the student. So sometimes I have that happening, but it's with like a student who, just misses class after class. I haven't seen them in 8 classes in a row. So I'm not going to have them sit down and take a test on the first day that they're in. But if it's a student that is consistently in class and I think that they can handle it, maybe like I sort of feel them out and I might have them take the assessment, and then I'm using that as their mastery, and I might fill in holes. But the other point that I was making when I was answering some of those questions is that you definitely want to. You don't want this to take you by surprise. So usually by the time you get to the assessment, if you have students like that, you've already had like several personal conversations with them because you see every day that they're falling behind. And if that's happening, like, 3 and 4 classes in a row, I've usually either emailed or called home as well, and say like, hey, I just want to introduce myself, not like to be down on them, but just to explain to them how this class works, how everything is available to the students 24/7. No, they don't just have to work on it in class, they can work on it at home. Yeah, they are 4 lessons behind right now. You know what I mean? Like, so you're sort of having those conversations to help them, keep accountable. Most of the students are keeping themselves accountable in the classes that I'm teaching. Like when I say most, I mean like 85%. And then you have to feel out the other kids and what's going to motivate them the most. Some students are motivated by hard deadlines. And so you have to hold that hard deadline and make them sit down for the test. Some students are demoralized by that. And if you make them sit down and take the test, they're not going to come back to your class for another, 4 weeks. So you really just have to have a sense for that when you're working with the student.
Jason, I really love your question. So Jason asks, can you talk about making connections in higher order learning in a mastery system? One concern I have is around the course becoming a bunch of lower level, easy to measure checkpoints and missing the conceptual ideas and connections. I think that, mastery-based learning, it's kind of, there's an element of it that automaticity is kind of at the core of what we do. However, I don't think that means we have to sacrifice. I think it needs to be both. I think we want our students to be mastering. We want our students to be mastering skills that's going to eventually deepen their understanding. We want them to be, we want understandings to compound on each other. Of course, I think the modern classroom structure does take a very constructivist approach, but we can't sacrifice those really rich opportunities to develop conceptual understanding. I think this is where in my classroom, things like the mid-unit seminar, the beginning of unit case study, putting in daily opening conversations, this becomes really important. And that was just a social studies class, for example. If you're an ELA teacher, it's going to be different. If you're a science teacher, it's going to be different. But I think that One resource so for me in my room, a lot of those deep conceptual understandings were days that they were kind of built on days we were not on the computers and everyone was doing a self-paced task. Now that's completely possible. You can do self-paced labs. You can find ways to do really meaningful deep dives. And I would say largely, if you're especially if you're doing a project-based learning class, it's very possible. But for my room specifically, this is where I really leaned heavy on collaboration and discussion, simply because that was just the nature I felt of a history classroom. So I don't have it handy right now, but if you go to modernclassrooms.org/webinars, you'll find a recent webinar we did on collaboration and discussion, which can be tricky in a self-paced classroom, I feel. But I think that the mastery-based element of my modern classroom really complemented when it was our time, students' time to practice deeper conceptual understandings, because in my history classroom, they just knew their content, or they knew their content more, and their skills were stronger because I was able to hold them to mastery. So when we did have an opportunity, again, in a seminar, in a multi-day project, in a debate, I saw these conceptual understandings actually grow deeper, because I would say not despite of my mastery-based system, but because of the mastery-based system in the classroom. Okay, I see Kevin's question. I saw a discussion in the course about setting up must, should, aspire to do's in a way, if only the musts are done, the max grade is say 80%. Is this a common approach? I would say that we see that approach quite a bit, and a lot of teachers take that approach. The key to remember with that is, of course, keeping in mind special circumstances of students, always erring on the side of I would say erring on the side of grace and understanding. And absolutely, when they have an IEP, when they have a 504, and there are accommodations and modifications to be made, I would never hold a student to 80%. If the highest grade you can get is 80% if all you do is must do's. I would never do that to a student who had required documented accommodations and modifications. So people do it. I would just say, know your students very well, know your data, and give everyone a fair shot. John asks, he says, one of the things that I love about modern classrooms is that some students who are not accustomed to actually reaching mastery at anything are completing a lesson to mastery for the first time. I see a huge boost in their confidence when they master a skill for the first time. Yes, it's one of the best things ever. However, because I am subject to traditional district grading policy, while the student may have mastered a lesson, he is getting an F and then feels like their hard work is on mastering that first skill was not truly fruitful. Okay, thoughts on how to work with that. So essentially, I think we see the student who absolutely lights up, is mastering a lesson. Maybe this is the first time in a long time they've been successful in school. However, the grade book is not reflecting that. Moira, what would you say about that?
I guess I need a little bit of clarification from John on, is it because they've only mastered one lesson, but they have like several lessons that they haven't done yet and they're put in as the zeros?
I think that's what I'm gathering.
Yeah, that's a thing. And that, yeah, I think that the good thing with the daily grading is that I know I've been able to draw that type of student in, because they do see that their grade goes up on a daily basis as they do these lessons, these small chunked lessons. And so like I had a student, not this school year, but the year before. I mean, he was starting off in the 20s because he had missed like months of school, but he was actually staying so close to me in my class because he was like, oh my gosh, now I have a 33. Now I have a 37. And so he was seeing it go up, and then he would go back and do more work. That is sort of a hard thing. We do put in, just like you're saying, John, the not turned in, and it calculates as a 0 for them as well. And that's such a good question. It's something that I'm really thinking about too, as we think about more like equitable grading practices. I would say just keep with the daily grading, keep close with those students in communicating why their grade is the way that it is, and then keep communicating to them what they can do to continue to bring their grade up.
Yeah, I agree with everything Moira's saying. I would also, for that particular student, I think I would strongly, the great thing about so much of modern classrooms is that they can do a lot of it outside of the classroom. They can access their teacher on their phone by watching the video. They can do assignments outside of the room generally. Mastery checks actually were the only thing I required to be done in my room. I think that this is an area where I would really try to have a frank conversation with the student about how you can do it. You've shown you can. It just might take more time. So where can we find this time? And then if you're like, and where can the student find the time, and where is you as teacher, where can you accommodate? Again, this might be, an instance of shorter practice, or perhaps the Ed Puzzle questions might give that student enough practice. The notes, again, are going to look different for this student. So whatever we can do to keep that student's light burning, let's try to do it. And I think it'll take different forms for different kids in different classes. Raymond, I did get your questions. It's very difficult for us to weigh in on implementing a whole school-wide policy for a new school. I would say that that's going to depend on the nature of the school. That's going to depend on, what's being taught. I would say just emphasizing general best practices for grading and what that's going to look like. If you're, I'm not sure if you're implementing modern classrooms school-wide, but I would say the Johns Hopkins 4 principles of chunking our content, of providing adequate opportunities for practice, assessing frequently, providing instructive feedback, adjusting instruction as needed, across the building. Those are best practices when we're grading for mastery. You also asked a question about how does mastery contribute to a student's GPA directly. I would say, well, when we grade for mastery, we take the highest grade. And kind of, I think Monty's example was one where she talked about how students' grades is going to be directly impacted. I'll go back to her slide just very quickly, because she talks about how even if a student did not show mastery on the initial mastery check, what she does then is, given the summative assessment at the end of the unit, if a student showed mastery on a particular standard, then she raises the score on the mastery check because they showed mastery eventually, if we're grading by the standard. That in turn is going to affect a student's GPA because they're going to get a higher grade in the class. So I think that they will correlate. If you're grading to mastery, and that's going to reflect your students, mastery is going to be reflected in students' grades. A GPA, of course, is composed of the students' grades. So that's how that would translate. We have time for a couple more. Moira is a practicing teacher, and I want to be sure that she gets an opportunity to sleep. Again, our Facebook group is a really great opportunity. It's where you can really ask some of the very specific grading questions. So if you're not a member of that, I highly encourage that. Let's see, we've got
Tanya's question is good.
Okay.
Yeah, and her question is about, like, you have 3 lessons and, like, are you going to need to reteach? And so the idea is that you would release all 3 lessons on the first day, and the students can watch the video, do the assignment, take the mastery check. If the students are struggling, you'll start to see that a little bit. You might then want to pull small groups of students and be teaching the lesson. But generally speaking, you're not like teaching the lesson each day. So you wouldn't be necessarily going back. I don't know if that makes sense, or if Kate, if you want to clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm just sorry. I'm rereading the question just to be sure that I understand it. Students in different steps. No, Moira, I would echo the same thing.
Yeah.
The same thing you said. Yeah. Yeah.
And then Bridget's question is great. And one thing that I like about your question, Bridget, is that this was such an unintended consequence for me. I was adopting the Modern Classroom's instructional model to help students who were chronically absent in my classes. But I have some students that are on the other end of the spectrum and who were, elite athletes and were trying to apply for like Division I sports. And so they were absent all the time, or they were on travel teams. And their parents were like, thank you. We love this model. We love this class. And those kids were carrying A's all the time. And they never, like, nothing was ever late because they could work ahead and they could work with their schedule. And the parents were just so appreciative of it. But in terms of like the mastery grade based grading with honors students that are arguing between an A and an A minus, that probably comes down to continuing to work on your rubrics and making sure that they're strong and making sure that you're able to communicate that to students.
Yeah, I think that one quick thing that I'll add is I've read that some research does suggest that test anxiety can get worse in a mastery-based learning environment. So I think that you're already on the right track. It sounds like you really know your students. So just orienting to the process of mastery, why we do this, and I would say in whatever way possible, kind of trying to get our students to know their why, if you will, of what's motivating this, and if there's interesting social emotional opportunities there. So you're on to something, definitely, that with that concern, and other educators have expressed that. I think Moira, I really like how you say, like, when it's so funny, it's like an unintended consequence. You develop a mastery-based system to help students who maybe don't have the best attendance, and then we have new pressures on other students. So it's a really interesting question. I just want to be sure that I didn't miss one.
Yeah, and Bridget, I think the other, this doesn't totally take off the pressure with, students that are putting a lot of pressure on themselves, and their parents might be too. But this is one reason I really like that step 7 reflection that I have had weekly this year, because it gives me a chance for me to get into their head, because they're telling me what's going on with them. But then for me to again, like, say, like, this is what you need to work on, like, you can get there. So if they are, if they're hardworking, they can always get to an A. I think sometimes what happens is, and I've been guilty of this in the past also, is that those students are so used to getting an A for completion. And that's where the frustration comes in.
We've got a few podcast episodes about that. Yeah, that shift. That it can take a while, and it's not always at the same pace for each student kind of arriving at this point.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. The fact that I was texting with a friend earlier tonight, and I said something about how we were doing this webinar on mastery-based grading, and my friend said, oh my gosh, you're gonna have teachers come and they're gonna come talk about school stuff on a school night. This just shows such your dedication. Thank you so much for joining us. Please come next month, 1 month from today. It's fun when February and March work like that, where we'll be doing a webinar on project-based grading in a modern classroom. We are really excited about that one. You'll be able to find the recording of this webinar at modernclassrooms.org/webinars, and we'll be sending the deck that'll have lots of helpful notes that we put in the chat, but they'll live in the speaker notes of this deck as well. Teachers, please take care of yourselves. You are doing so much right now. And you did this on a school night. So You're remarkable. Teachers are remarkable humans.
You're so engaged.
Yes, but again, if you we are sending this we are sending the deck out to everyone who attended. That'll be in an email tomorrow, and the recording, you can always find the recordings as well at modernclassrooms.org/webinars. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.